What's a high school graduate kid doing here?
The man frowned as he spoke, and I flinched instinctively. His unbelievably rude attitude sparked anger within me. I'm here to. Just as I was about to explain, something unbelievable happened. My name is Henry. I'm 22 years old and work as a software engineer. My parents passed away in a car accident when I was a college student. I moved to my grandmother's house, which was a little farther away. But since I couldn't rely on my elderly grandmother, I decided to drop out of college and start working. The person I reached out to was Greg Williams, the CEO of the company where my dad had worked for many years. My dad's office was close to my childhood home, and since both my parents worked, I would sometimes stop by there when I needed something. Greg had been a senior to my dad during their student days. He had known me since I was born, and would always greet me with a smile and hand me some candy whenever I visited. When my parents passed away, he even reached out to check on me, telling me to contact him if I ever needed anything. I had thought about continuing college while living with my grandmother, but I was embarrassed to admit that and felt ashamed. The commute time had also increased significantly, and I decided it wasn't worth the tuition anymore, so I left school. I had been in the information technology program and always had top grades, so my friends and professors tried to dissuade me from quitting. But I knew I would eventually need to care for my grandmother, and I wanted to avoid touching my parents' inheritance as much as possible. Thinking that way, I realized I had no choice but to earn my own living. I reached out to Greg and poured out my thoughts. I didn't want to burden my grandmother with my worries, but I could be honest with him. I even cried during the call, and he comforted me. By the time I reached out, his company had grown significantly and even had subsidiary companies. Greg suggested I try working part-time at one of those subsidiaries. Although the company didn't care much about academic credentials, it was uncommon for someone my age to work there. He made an exception and offered me a part-time role with the possibility of full-time employment depending on my performance. I had only worked part-time at restaurants before, but this job paid much better. And more importantly, I'd be doing software engineering work I'd always dreamed of. I immediately accepted. When I started working at the subsidiary, the department manager assigned as my mentor had once worked with my dad. I thought his face looked familiar, and I realized I'd seen him a few times when visiting my dad's office. Thanks to his mentorship, I went from handling simple tasks to working on actual software development.
Henry, you're doing a much better job than most new graduates looking to become software engineers.
He was confident in my abilities and vouched for me. Within a year, I was promoted to a contract employee, and now I work as a full-time employee. This year, at 22 years old, I received great news from my manager.
Henry, you've been transferred to the main office.
He told me this, and I nodded enthusiastically. I had been involved in major projects at the subsidiary and achieved good results. The transfer came because of those accomplishments. At 22, I was also the youngest employee in the main office. I even received a call from Greg himself. He wanted me to join a project he was launching. I knew my schedule would get much busier, but I found my work meaningful, and I wanted to support Greg, who had helped me so much. Before starting at the main office, I was asked to come in for a meeting. When I arrived at the main office and asked the receptionist, she told me that Greg's meeting was running late and that he'd be back soon. She contacted him and asked me to wait in the CEO's office. Following her instructions, I took the elevator to the third floor, where I encountered a man carrying documents. "Good morning." I greeted him and started heading toward the CEO's office at the end of the hallway, as directed. But the man called out to me in a stern voice.
Hey, take this.
Without giving me a chance to respond, he shoved the documents into my arms, so I had no choice but to follow him. When we arrived at a conference room that was being prepped for a meeting, he said,
Set them up there.
Then he casually sipped his coffee. Clearly, he had mistaken me for someone else. Well, I am. I began to explain, but was cut off.
New hires should just keep quiet and listen to what I say. I'm an elite on the fast track to promotion. You can't go wrong following me.
He proudly bragged about being a department head and having graduated from a prestigious university. It seemed he thought I was a new recruit. At first, I assumed he was just competent at his job. But his personality was awful.
So, where did you go to college?
He asked me with an arrogant tone. I dropped out of college. I began to explain. But he interrupted me again.
Dropped out. So you're just a high school graduate.
Before I could continue, he bombarded me with more questions.
What's a high school graduate doing in our company? Who are you? You're not one of our new hires, are you?
He spoke rapidly, frowning the entire time. Even though his intensity was overwhelming, I managed to say, I've been transferred here from a subsidiary, and I'm meeting with our CEO, Greg. But once again, he cut me off.
Oh, it's you.
The man glared at me menacingly.
You're part of that project team. The CEO mentioned bringing someone over from the subsidiary, and you're just a high school graduate. Nobody told me they were adding an incompetent kid to the team. Let me make one thing clear. The project leader is me.
His words made my blood boil. But this person was supposed to be my superior. I clenched my fists and swallowed my anger. I wanted to push back, but I didn't know how to respond in moments like this. Seeing my hesitation, the department head chuckled through his nose.
I bet you pulled some strings. A high school grad getting hired here and even getting transferred to the main office. Who'd you bribe? Useless kids like you never last. You better be ready to get kicked off this project.
I needed to say something. Well, I started to speak, but he grabbed his coffee and walked toward me.
Don't talk back. To you, I'm an absolute authority. If you get removed from this project, you're heading straight back to that little subsidiary.
Not knowing how to respond, I blurted out without thinking. Oh, okay. The department head glared at me. And in the next moment, he poured the coffee over my head. Thankfully, the coffee had cooled, so it wasn't hot, but I was too stunned by his actions to even react. The bitter smell of coffee wafted through the air, and droplets hit the floor. The department head looked at the mess, pointed at me, and laughed.
You don't need to attend the meeting. Having a useless high school grad like you around is a waste of time. The meeting starts soon, so clean this up and get out of here.
With that, he left the conference room. I was so humiliated that I couldn't move. A few moments later, the conference room door opened, snapping me out of my daze. Shoot, I need to clean this up. Just as I thought that, I heard a familiar voice.
Henry, there you are.
It was Greg, and he looked at me and asked.
What happened here?
I hesitated, but finally said, I think I was mistaken for a new hire and got roped into helping with the meeting setup. Greg furrowed his brow. I knew that wasn't what he was really asking. As for the coffee, it was a bit of a mishap. I forced a smile as I answered. Greg immediately pulled out his phone and made a call. Within moments, a man hurried over and handed me a towel. He seemed to be Greg's assistant. I thanked him, took the towel, and finally wiped my face and head. Greg led me to his office. He directed me to the washroom, where I was able to wash my face and hair. The lingering coffee smell finally disappeared. The assistant even brought me a change of clothes, which I gratefully accepted. I felt bad and kept my head down the whole time. Seeing that, Greg chuckled.
You're just like your dad in that way.
It was true, my dad had always been humble, and even Greg remembered him that way.
Your dad was a brilliant engineer. I'm sure you've inherited his talent.
Hearing him speak so highly of my dad made me genuinely happy, since he was the reason I'd pursued this career in the first place. The next day, I reported to the main office. During the morning assembly, Greg announced that he would introduce me. In front of the assembled employees, he said,
Let me introduce my right-hand man.
Standing directly in front of me was the same department head from yesterday.
You're the guy from yesterday.
The department head's eyes widened in disbelief. He turned to Greg and asked,
What do you mean by your right-hand man?
Greg, calm as ever, replied,
Henry will be my right-hand man. In other words, the project leader will be Henry.
What?
The department head shouted. Yesterday, he had told me he was the project leader. I had believed that too, but now I was the leader. Even during yesterday's meeting with Greg, he hadn't mentioned this, so I was just as shocked. Greg smiled warmly as he spoke.
I had a meeting with Henry yesterday. Despite his young age, he has valuable professional experience and a solid way of thinking. His reputation at the subsidiary is excellent, so I decided to put him in charge as the leader.
The department head's voice trembled.
But I'm supposed to be the leader.
Greg chuckled and replied,
There's no way you're the leader. You lack the necessary knowledge.
At that, several people around us couldn't hold back their laughter. It was clear from their reactions that the department head wasn't well liked. His face turned pale. Once the morning assembly ended, Greg called both the department head and me into his office. The department head shot me a glare and muttered under his breath.
Why someone like you?
Greg spoke to the department head in a stern tone.
Tell me everything that happened yesterday.
The department head feigned ignorance and said,
What are you talking about?
But Greg wasn't backing down.
You met with Henry yesterday, didn't you?
The department head seemed to realize he couldn't wriggle his way out and lied instead.
Yes, I dropped some documents, and he kindly picked them up. He said he wanted to help, so I just had him assist with the meeting setup.
At that moment, he glared at me. It was clear he wanted me to keep my mouth shut. However, before I could say anything, Greg spoke.
Henry didn't tell me anything, but you do know there are security cameras in that conference room, right?
The department head's eyes widened in shock, and his face instantly turned pale.
I know everything you did. Your punishment will be decided later, but you should prepare to lose your position as department head.
When Greg said that, the department head let out a desperate shout.
No, I just went a little too far yesterday. I promise I'll make this project a success.
Greg let out a sigh. At that point, I finally spoke up. Are you saying it's just fooling around when you pour coffee on someone? I've never seen anyone do that before. Is that kind of behavior normal at this company? If it is, then I won't say anything. And if that really is the norm, does that mean it's fine if I pour coffee on the department head as a joke too? I picked up the cup of coffee that the assistant had brought in, and the department head shook his head furiously, his face pale.
No, I'm sorry.
He repeated it over and over. I set the cup back down on the table and sighed. Yesterday, Greg explained the details of the project to me. He said I was the only one who could handle it. Sure, maybe someone like you, with a prestigious college degree, seems more qualified than someone like me, a high school graduate. Greg listened carefully to everything I said. The department head stared at me with his face still as pale as ever. But everyone has their strengths, right? I may be a high school graduate for personal reasons, but I've earned several system-related certifications and have relevant experience. This project is incredibly challenging without the proper qualifications. Do you have any certifications? The department head averted his gaze. I understood his answer. I can't hand over leadership of this project to someone unqualified. Besides, from what I saw at the morning assembly, it was clear that your coworkers don't trust you. Honestly, we can't entrust a project close to the CEO's heart to someone like that. As I spoke, the department head turned red and started shouting.
You've got no right to say that to me.
I knew that. It wasn't something I should have said. But I wanted to make this project a success for Greg no matter what. To achieve that, I had to remove someone like the department head from the equation. The department head seemed to lose his composure completely, even in front of the CEO, and continued mocking me.
Is this revenge over some spilled coffee? Such a childish move. You're just a lowly high school graduate. You brag about having certifications, but anyone can get those if they study a bit.
At that, Greg interjected.
You're absolutely right.
I blinked in surprise. But his next words made perfect sense.
Henry studied incredibly hard to earn those certifications, and he did it in record time. If anyone can earn them, then I expect you to obtain these certifications within the next 2 months.
Greg slammed a brochure with the certification details onto the table. They were known to be some of the toughest certifications in the field. It was the most challenging certification I had ever earned. but I only had about 2 months to study because I had to get several others as well. Greg remembered that.
Of course, that's no problem.
The department head muttered, caught off guard. Greg decided to hold off on the department head's punishment, but things soon took a turn. A few days later, the department head went crying to Greg, saying he couldn't understand the certification materials at all. Disappointed, Greg told him to apologize to me, but the department head stubbornly refused. That attitude pushed me over the edge. What is your problem? Both Greg and the department head were stunned by my outburst, but I didn't care. You ordered me around the moment we met, mocked me for being a high school graduate, and even poured coffee on me. Do you realize I could sue you for defamation and assault? And you better pay for my dry cleaning bill too. I stepped closer to the bewildered department head. If a high school graduate like me can earn those certifications, anyone should be able to, right? So why is it that you, after saying all that, have no idea what you're doing? I let out a mocking laugh. Maybe you shouldn't make bold claims if you can't back them up. People who talk big but lack the skills to deliver are pathetic. The department head's eyes welled up with tears, seemingly scared of me. Finally, in a pitiful voice, he broke down crying.
Why do I have to be humiliated like this by you?
Greg sighed deeply.
Henry is absolutely right. You need to reflect on your actions. You're being demoted starting next month, and your bonus will be cut.
The department head pleaded with Greg.
But what about my mortgage?
Watching him grovel, I muttered, "You reap what you sow." Greg nodded in agreement. The former department head, now a regular employee, worked under the disapproving gaze of his colleagues to pay off his mortgage. Word spread quickly about how he had poured coffee on me and later broke down in tears when confronted. Some details were exaggerated, but his story became a source of amusement for the rest of the employees. His work environment grew uncomfortable, but that was his own doing. Although I gained a reputation as someone who could lose his temper, I grew closer to my colleagues through the project, and thankfully, the misunderstanding was cleared up. The project was going smoothly, and Greg told me,
Choosing you for this role was the right decision.
I owe everything to Greg for giving me this opportunity. I'll keep paying him back in any way I can.